بارك على نبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. Today, inshallah ta'ala, we'll continue with the series of Tazkiyah pearls, and today's session I'm going to talk about origins of this knowledge, some rules and some nomenclature as well. The origin of this knowledge, as I pointed out yesterday, comes from the Prophet's ﷺ explanations and the way he spoke about Islam. And the hadith narrated by Imam Muslim, where the Prophet ﷺ says, ألا إن في الجسد مضغة إذا صلح الجسد كله وإذا فسدت فسد الجسد كله ألا وهي القلب. So he explained ﷺ in this hadith that indeed within the body there is a piece, there's a part of the body that's the qalb, right? And he's not talking about the physical heart here. He's not giving a lesson in biology or in medicine, but he's talking spiritually. The heart, if it is sound, if there's purity in it, then the rest of the body will function well. And if it's not, if it's corrupt, then the rest of the body will also be corrupt, meaning the actions will be corrupt. And of course within this there's a lot to learn, because we have to understand what is the qalb to begin with, and if we understand what it is, well, how do we purify it, and what exactly is the method of doing this, and if we don't do it, what risk do we actually run, and how does that risk present itself? So all of these are questions that are quite valid, and if you don't have answers for them, then the Prophet ﷺ left you with a piece of information that you have nothing to do with, and that's not appropriate. So this knowledge, or this ilm, began similarly to all of the other Islamic disciplines. So after he passed away ﷺ by a number of decades, certain disciplines of Islamic knowledge started to grow. Qira'at, for example, it took them around 100 years before all 10 were put together and classified and verified, and the rules were all agreed upon. Same thing goes for the knowledge of hadith. It took maybe 150 years for it to kind of find its form and begin, and the scholars of that discipline to start actually narrating the hadith and putting it down in books and talking about the chains of narration. Same thing goes for the knowledge of usul al-fiqh and fiqh, and aqidah, tawheed. All of these disciplines didn't exist during his life ﷺ, because you didn't need them. You had him ﷺ. You just did whatever he taught, whatever he said, however he lived, you just emulated. You had a role model that you followed. And that still applies today, by the way. It still applies today when you find, and we'll talk about this towards the end of this series, but you find a scholar, you find a sheikh, you learn from this person, you follow and you emulate. You don't have to not everyone has to be a scholar of Islamic knowledge in order for things to work. They just have to make sure that they have someone that they can follow and learn from. However, if you increase the Islamic literacy amongst a community to a certain degree, then everyone benefits, and for sure the ummah will benefit from having that. But as all these other disciplines of knowledge were built, this knowledge, ilm al-tazkiyah, also began early on with scholars like Imam al-Hasan al-Basri and Malik ibn Dinar, and their students, the Nun al-Misri, wa Ma'ruf al-Karkhi, wa Sari al-Saqati, wa Imam al-Junayd, and all of these individuals that lived within the first maybe 200 to 250 years after of Hijrah, after he passed away, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam ajma'in. And they put the usul, they put the basis, the bases of this knowledge. And this Imam Sahel Tustari rahimahullah, he would say قواعد هذا العلم ثلاث. There are three bases there are three principles for this knowledge. الاقتداء برسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في الأخلاق والأفعال, emulating the Prophet عليه الصلاة والسلام in his ethics and in his actions. وأكل الحلال, and only eating halal, وإخلاص النية في جميع الأعمال, and making sure that your intention is pure in all actions. So they started putting down the laws and the rules for this science. And the books that talk about this, if you go back, and I'm going back early on. For example, if I talk to you about hadith, what are the early books that talked about this? Muwatta al-Imam Malik would be the first book that you would want to go to. And then you would go to the Sahihain, Bukhari or Muslim. So what books talked about this? All of the books that were called Zuhd, back in those days. Zuhd that was written by Imam Waqi' al-Jarrah, or Zuhd by Hannad, and Zuhd by Imam Ahmad. All these books talked about this knowledge and documented it. The books that start with the word Mukhtasar, Shu'ab al-Iman, for example, Imam Bayhaqi, or Adhkar, Imam al-Nawawi. Books that were, all the books that were written by Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, and a lot of the books written by Ibn al-Qayyim. Ibn al-Qayyim has a book called Madarij al-Salikin, in which he explains a book called Manazil al-Sa'irin, written by Imam Abdullah al-Harawi, rahimahullah, which is one of the most probably powerful books within this within this field. Al-Ihya is probably the most famous of books that was written by Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. So there is a well-established discipline of knowledge that has within it books that talk about what exactly it is that you're expected to do and how you're going to go by these teachings. You see, when you go to the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about why He sends prophets multiple times in the Quran. You find it in Surah Al-Jumu'ah, you find it in Surah Al-Baqarah, you find it in Surah Ali Imran. And maybe the most powerful that I recite in Surah Al-Jumu'ah, probably هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم. He is the one who sent amongst the illiterate a prophet amongst themselves to do four things. يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِهِ وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ. Four things. He's going to point them to God. يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِهِ. The signs of Allah, He's going to show them the signs so that they know who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, because that's your belief, your tawheed, your aqeedah. You have to know what you believe in. You have to have that solid, and it has to be appropriate. It can't be corrupt. That's where corruption enters. Corruption enters into your i'tiqad. That's how you end up with shuraka. That's how people end up with shirk, is that they don't have a clear understanding of what their i'tiqad is. And then يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ. And He teaches them the book, the rulings, وَالْحِكْمَةَ, and the wisdom, how to practice these rulings. But then وَيُزَكِّيهِمْ. You find it everywhere. See, Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he made the dua, he said, رَبَّنَا وَبَعَثْ فِيهِمْ رَسُولًا مِّنْهُمْ يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِكَ وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَيُزَكِّيهِم. He took وَيُزَكِّيهِم, put it at the end of the, he knew what the four were, but he put يُزَكِّيهِم at the end. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would respond to his dua, لَقَدْ مَنَّ اللَّهُ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ إِذْ بَعَثَ فِيهِمْ رَسُولًا مِّنْ أَنفُسِهِمْ. He would fix the sequence, يَتْلُو عَلَيْهِمْ آيَاتِهِ وَيُزَكِّيهِم وَيُعَلِّمُهُمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ. Situate it where it needs to be situated. This is the second purpose of sending prophets in general. The second purpose of prophecies is to teach people how to purify themselves, how to cleanse their souls, how to cleanse their hearts. And that's the origin of this knowledge. So this is a knowledge that was established similarly to all of the other disciplines of Islam. It didn't come later. If anything, it came a little bit earlier. And it's been something that's been taught and handed down generation after generation for hundreds of years. And just like you would not want to learn the discipline of hadith from a nahwi, or someone who studies, who specializes in Arabic grammar, or from a mufassir, from someone who specializes in breaking down the meanings of the Quran. You want to learn this knowledge from those who teach it. You want to learn the knowledge of tazkiyah from those who specialize in it. Specialty is important even within Islamic disciplines, to know exactly what it is that they're talking about so they can actually offer you something that is beneficial to you. There are a number of rules that apply to this discipline that you need to listen to here at the beginning, memorize them so you can follow them along as we move. The first rule of Tazkiyah. Has anyone here seen Fight Club in the past? Yeah. The first rule of Tazkiyah, it's all about you. It's all about you. The second rule of Tazkiyah, it's about no one but you. The third rule of Tazkiyah is only going to be about you. You're not allowed to take anything you learn in Tazkiyah and project it on other people. When you learn this knowledge, you project it on yourself. If you take this and you project it on other people, don't learn it. Honestly, pray Fajr, go home. Don't listen to a word I have to say. If you're going to take what I say and then project it on a family member or your spouse, God forbid, or even your children, then you're going to harm yourself. Because this knowledge, at least when you start learning it, when you begin learning it, when you just start, you have to take what you listen to and you have to apply it to yourself. You have to start with yourself. You have to in your mind think about other people that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has guided them and that they have a special place with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They're fine yawm al-qiyamah. You're the only one who's at danger on the day of judgment, which is why you're taking all of this and you're applying it to yourself. You look at other people with the lens of empathy and compassion. You look at them through the lens that they are in a different position, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they have something between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that's going to allow them to make it yawm al-qiyamah. Unless they come and ask you for guidance. Unless they say, I want you to mentor me, teach me. And in that case, you start being critical. And you watch them for their own sake. Otherwise, you don't have, I have students in Tazkiyah. I'll hold them accountable for mistakes, for words, for things they do. But the moment they don't want to attend, that's it. They go back to a regular human being again. And I observe nothing of what they do. And I hold them accountable for nothing at all. It's very important that this knowledge is used and you project it upon yourself When we talk about humbleness, you don't take that and then apply it to someone else and say they should be humble. No, 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 no. This is for you to be humble, so you can become humble. Right? You have to focus on your humbleness. There is a point where you can start teaching others, for sure. There will become a moment where you can start teaching others this, but not at the beginning, and not for a while. Not for a while. The first rule and second and third rule of Tazkiyah is that this is all about you. What you learn, you take and you think about how it should apply to yourself, or else I am giving you tools that will ruin your relationship with al-khalq. Or I'll be giving you tools that will ruin your relationship with other people and put you in a position where I'm actually harming you. You'll harm yourself, I guarantee it. If you project what you learn on other people and you hold them accountable to the teachings that you learn something new about how it is you should see others and how you should derive value and what type of principles you should carry. If you learn things about this and it's powerful and you project it on someone else because they're not following it, or you think or you assume that they're not following it, then you harm yourself, because now the number of sins that you make by doing that is so many that it accumulates into something horrible. However, you take what you learn and you apply it to yourself. That's the first. The second rule is that everything that you learn in Tazkiyah requires reflection and contemplation. I'm going to talk about that specifically tomorrow. I'm going to talk about this concept specifically tomorrow. But everything requires a certain degree of reflection and contemplation. There has to be muraqabah, there has to be yaqada, there has to be nadar, there has to be tadabbur and ta'ammul. If you don't do this, then these concepts don't just exist. Just because you heard me say it doesn't mean it's going to become second nature to you. Doesn't mean that this is actually going to be something you can practice. You have to put in the effort. You have to put in the time in order to turn these concepts into something that is meaningful to you. And that requires a certain degree of reflection and contemplation. Number three, there are going to be exercises. Exercises are when you take upon yourself a certain behavior to try and learn something about yourself. You do something in a controlled environment that allows you to observe something about yourself. For example, this is just a simple example. At one point during my learning, I was told, and the Shaykh was very smart, he got me talking about my life and things I liked and things I did, and people I liked and people I didn't like. And once he found me talking about someone I didn't like, he told me that your exercise for the week is to serve him, to serve someone you dislike. He's a Muslim. It's not like I'm going to serve a Sahiyuni. I'm going to serve a Muslim, someone who's a Muslim. This person is extremely annoying. They've harmed me multiple times in the past and I don't like them. So my job was to serve him. I was supposed to come back next week with the report. I took 3 weeks and I almost dropped out from the whole thing and decided not to do it. It's just an exercise. You learn something about yourself when you're forced to do something that you don't want to do. You learn something about your nafs, and you learn how to tame it, and then you figure something out. And this is exercises. These riyadat are very important. You have to learn to dua al-mahsud, to make dua for someone that you envy. Make dua for someone that you envy. If you truly envy, make dua for them. It's harder than you think. It's much more difficult than you can imagine. We immediately jumped, no, I'm fine, I don't have any envy. Really, you don't, mashallah. Then what are you doing here? Like I said, if you're of that degree of closeness, everyone does. Everyone has some envy. And actually the whole point of Tazkiyah is figuring out where it lies in your heart and removing it and then dealing with it. The exercises are important. So when you're offered an exercise, you have to try it out. And you have to try it out sincerely, like really do it. And then the fourth rule is that there has to be a daily amount of wird and hizb. There has to be a daily amount of recitation of the Quran, a certain amount of hizb that you recite. The Prophet ﷺ, he cared about this a lot. He would command his ashab that they had to recite their hizb, and if they missed it, they made it up for it the next day. There's a hadith in Bukhari that if you miss the hizb, نِمْتَ عَنْهُ فَقْرَأْهُ مِنَ الصَّبَاحِ قَبْلَ الظُّهْرِ. If you sleep and you forget to read your hizb that day, then you make up for it in the morning. He gave people, the people who were interested in learning these things from him ﷺ, he gave them specific things they had to do. You have to read Quran every day. And it has to be something that you commit yourself to, even though you don't have to commit to this. Like this is not a faridah. The faridah is fajr and dhuhr and asr and maghrib and isha, and there's certain things that mafrood that you don't, but you have to commit yourself to something. And when you commit yourself to something, you actually commit, you treat it as if it's a faridah. And that is how you actually start getting closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's how you fall under the umbrella. وَمَا يَزَالُ عَبْدِي يَتَقَرَّبُ إِلَيَّ بِالنَّوَافِلِ حَتَّى أُحِبَّهُ. And my servant will continue to perform good deeds and commit himself to nawafil, to recommended deeds, until I love him. حتى أحب فإذا أحببته كنت سمعه الذي يسمع به وبصره الذي يبصر به. ويده التي يبطش بها ورجله التي يمشي بها ولئن سألني لأعطينه ولئن استعاذ بي لأعيذنه. And if I love him, then he will see through me, and he will hear through me. And when he moves, he will move with me. And when he walks, he will walk with me. And if he asks me, I will give him. And if he seeks refuge in me, I will grant him refuge. This is the goal. This is what you're trying to get. You're trying to put yourself under this umbrella, which is why we do these things. And make sure there's a certain degree of wird. There should be an amount of tasbihat. Whether you do them after salawat and you stick to them, commit to them, or you allow yourself twice a day to do istighfar and salah ala nabi alayhi salatu wasalam and la ilaha illallah. Each one you do 100 times, you start yourself off 300, 600 tasbihat, and then you build upon them. Abu Hurairah كان يقول كنت ألا إني أسبح الله في اليوم والليلة 30,000 تسبيحة. 30,000 tasbih. وكذلك عثمان ibn Affan. I had one of my teachers, wallahi, 10,000 times just salah ala Rasulullah alayhi salatu throughout the day. Just a part of his daily routine. A part of his daily routine. Yusalli ala Rasulullah alayhi salatu. The moment you're not talking to him, he's going through his salawat. He's going through his tasbihat. He's going through his tahlilat and tahmidat. You can't start with 30,000. You can barely get 500 a day, but you start with 500 or whatever you start with, and then slowly over time you add another 100, then you add another 100, and by maybe 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 10 years, you end up with something where لا يزال لسانك رطبا بذكر الله. Your tongue is always running through and you don't have to count anymore. After a while, you don't have to count numbers anymore. Your tongue is just always running with the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But you start with numbers and you commit yourself. Why? Because you're trying to tame this nafs that doesn't want to do any of this. The last piece of today's session is to talk to you about, so those are the 4 rules. The first one is all about you. Do not project what you learn upon others. Project what you learn upon yourself. Leave others. If they are not asking you for mentorship and coaching and supervision, let them, between them and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The nush piece we will talk about. I will explain to you when and how to do it. But for the majority of the time, this is all about you. You have to project this on yourself. You have to make sure that there's a certain amount of awrad and adhkar that you and hizb that you commit yourself to, that you reflect and contemplate everything that we talk about. Everything requires a certain degree of reflection, and I'll explain this in detail tomorrow, right? And then there'll be exercises that you need to apply to yourself. You have to try things and see how you respond, and become sensitive to the changes that occur inside your nafs. You have to become sensitive to the feelings. Oh, that's my nafs not wanting to do this. That's my nafs hate. That's my nafs coming into play. It doesn't like it. And when you start becoming sensitive, you'll start to know in life in general. When something happens and you feel something, you'll know, is this the nafs not liking it? Because that's usually a pretty good indicator that you should do it anyways. Right? The nafs is good at making you feel bad about something and then rationalizing why it's not a good idea to do it in the first place. So you have to become a bit smarter. I know that feeling. I know that sound. I know who this is. That's not, I do this. And that obviously requires a little bit of finesse, and we'll talk about it. The nomenclature, so the terminology, that's important. I'm going to talk about five words. These words are important for you to understand. Number 1, al-ruh, which is the spirit. Al-ruh min amri rabbi. This is an issue of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is the elevated aspect of you. This is who you are. When you sit down and you think of things of high nature, that metacognition, your ability to wonder about wondering and think about thought, for you to hope for goodness for other people, for you not to be selfish, for you to find empathy in your heart towards others, all of this comes from the ruh. It's something that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The details of what it is we don't know. We just know that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about, فَلْنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِ, I blew within him of my spirit. What exactly that means, no one will understand, because this is something that is specific to the divine himself subhanahu wa ta'ala. But what we do know is that ruh is something from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not from this alam al-shahada. It's not from this observable universe. It does not come from the soil of the earth. It's not something that's tangible, that's measurable. It's something that comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and allows you to be who you are. You are your spirit. And in that sense, when you pass away, your spirit just moves on from A to B. It's your body that dies. And obviously what comes with it. That's the first piece, al-ruh. Number 2, an-nafs. An-nafs, as I explained yesterday, it was born when the ruh and the body came together. The nafs needs the body to exist. Once the body stops existing, the nafs stops existing as well. And if you just understand that, you can understand a lot about this nafs that you carry within you, inside you. The word soul is how I use to explain it. Right? This is the word that I'm going to use to refer to the nafs. The nafs starts ammarat bisu. It starts in a position where it will command you to do things that you shouldn't be doing. And if you tame it, and if you're capable of changing its ways, it can turn into nafs mutma'innah. It can turn to a nafs radiyah mardiyah. It can turn into a nafs that is different, that functions differently. But it doesn't start out like that. It starts out for everyone almost pretty much the same. Ammara bisu. Why is it ammara bisu? Because the nafs is understanding of life is that of survival, and your nafs is your biggest fan. No one loves you more than your nafs. Your nafs is your best cheerleader. It's standing on the sidelines and is clapping for you at all times. And it wants you to be the best. It wants you to survive and to live the longest and to be the most powerful. It's all based on its instincts. It understands the world through instincts. It thinks if you eat more, you're going to be full more, meaning you're going to live longer. If you're able to choose the food from the beginning, that means you're never going to go hungry. If you are stronger, if you are superior, if you're the boss, that means you're less likely to be injured and harmed and you're less likely to die. You'll live longer. So in the nafs mind, this is how it's saving you. It's by making sure you're on top of the haram. You're on the top of the food chain, on the triangle. You're sitting up there. Right? It doesn't know what's best for you. The nafs problem, it just doesn't know what's best for you. It thinks that that's what's best for you. Have you ever sat in front of food when you're hungry and worried about how many pieces of falafel there's there, looking at how many people are in the room? At any point in your life, if you've sat down and there's too many people in the room and you start making a calculation of how many pieces there are and how many people there are, and you start worrying about the food, even though you're not going to starve, there's enough food on the plate for you to eat. That is your nafs calculating, worrying about your survival, wanting you to be ahead of everyone, on top of everything. It doesn't know any better. We're not here to hate our nufus. We don't hate them. No, not at all. We love our nafs, but we have to understand that our nafs doesn't know what it's doing. That if we follow it, it's like you're following a child. You're following it. The nafs is a child. Everything that you know about your nafs, you see in a 3-year-old. 3-year-olds, they don't have any filters. They haven't learned to cover any part of their nufus. They just let it out, and it's hilarious at 3-year-olds. It's not hilarious at 30. It's not funny at 30 at all. It's not funny at all. At 3, it's funny. It's interesting when you bring 2 pieces of chocolate and give them to the 3-year-old and say, give one to your friend, and he looks at them and he shoves them into his mouth really quickly. Well, it's funny because it's a part of, but that's the nafs. It doesn't want to share. Why share? Explain to the nafs why it would share. The goal is survival. The goal is superiority. That's how we're going to be. That's how the nafs is taking care of you. So why would it share it with someone else? It makes no sense at all. That's why if you bring 2 toys, you give one to the kid and another to the other kid, suddenly they don't want it anymore. He wants it as long as the other person doesn't have it. If the other person has it, he loses interest. He throws it away. Why? Because now he doesn't have an edge over the other person. The other person is not inferior to him anymore, so he throws it. He needs something. He needs to prove. So he throws away what he has and goes and takes what's in the hand of the other person. At 2 years old, it's really funny and it's enjoyable, but it's not afterwards. This is just the reaction of that nafs. The nafs wants what's best for you. It just doesn't know what's best for you. It wants to protect you. It just doesn't know how to protect you. And the nafs is scared of death because that means it's gone. The ruh doesn't fear death because the ruh is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's just in this body for a while, then it's gone. But the nafs, its existence is based on this body. So once the body is gone, it's gone too. Which is why people fear death so much, because it's the nafs, it's not you. It's not your ruh that's fearing death, it's your nafs that's fearing death. And I'm going to talk about mortality in its own session, inshallah, altogether. But that's the nafs. And tazkiyatha wa mujahadatuha, for you to strive against it and for you to tame it, it's like a wild horse. But once you tame it, this is what he said alayhi salatu wasalam in the hadith Ibn Majah. قَالْ لَا يُؤْمِنُ أَحَدُكُمْ حَتَّى يَكُونَ هَوَاهُ تَبَعًا لِمَا جِئْتُ بِهِ. None of you actually achieve full iman until your hawa. Hawa is a third piece of nomenclature, are the desires of the nafs. Al-hawa is just the word that describes the desires of this nafs. What does this nafs want? It wants all the food. It wants all the water. It wants relations. Forgive me for it wants a lot of sex, because that means you'll have a lot of progeny. It means you will live longer. Like your DNA lives longer, and you have more children, so they'll protect you. That's how the nafs looks at things. It wants to be superior. It wants to be the boss. It wants to command everyone. These are the desires of the nafs. So the status and the wealth, and that's what the nafs wants. And it's called hawa. So the Prophet ﷺ says that you don't achieve true iman until your hawa becomes aligned with my teachings. Your hawa can become aligned with the teachings of the Prophet ﷺ. You can do it. You can get your nafs, you can actually use the strength of this nafs to take you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Instead of the nafs pulling the other way the whole time, you're like, but salli. No, I don't want to. Ya akhi, I want to pray, be quiet, and the nafs doesn't want to pray. This can change, where the nafs takes you to the masjid. Where the carrot now that the nafs is running after is aligned with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's teachings. This can happen, and your nafs will take you to Allah, where you don't have to worry about this anymore. You start focusing, as the Prophet ﷺ was. The focus becomes on details, on perfecting things, the smallest mistakes. That's why when we read about the Prophet ﷺ mistakes in the Quran, if I can even use that word, may Allah forgive me. What are they? عَبَسَ وَتَوَلَّى عَفَى اللَّهُ عَنْكَ لِمَا أَذِنْتَ لَهُم. Things that for me, they would be a good deed. If I did these things, I would consider myself getting hasanat that day. If I was doing what he was doing in da'wah alayhi salatu wasalam, and I frowned for a moment because I had to leave the hard work and do the easy work, I would feel proud of myself. I wanted to do the hard work. The Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam was held to a standard. No, you're not even that. But he can't even see. It doesn't matter if he can't see. It doesn't matter if you can't see. You never do that. Sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Because he tamed his nafs, and his nafs now was leading him to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Another word for the word nafs is the ego. And I'll use that term as well. So when I talk about the ego, or I talk about the soul, or I talk about the nafs, to me they're all terms that are interchangeable. That's number 3. Number 4, al-qalb. Al-qalb is the subconsciousness. The qalb is this big pot, this big melting pot. That everything that is happening around you is pouring into this pot. Everything. And it's being mixed all the time. It's just one big mixing pot. Someone says, hey, mixing what's going in. Whatever you put in, what you see and what you hear and what you think about and the environment around you and your experiences and what you're learning, all of that is just pouring into this big pot. And from this pot, there's output. And that output affects your emotions. How you feel about things comes from this qalb. How you feel about things. If you are, just so you understand, if you look at haram and you listen to haram and you think about haram and you're learning haram and your environment is haram, what do you think is going to come out of the pot? Rida Allah wa rida al-walidain. What do you think is going to come out of the pot? If whatever you put in comes out. If garbage in, then garbage out. And if you want khair in, then you have to have khair being put in there. And that's what it's the subconsciousness. It's what happens. It's the part of you. You can control it, but not directly. And we're going to talk about this in its own session. You can control it, but not directly. You don't have a direct control of the heart. It's an indirect, prolonged period of control. You can control it. You can decide how you want to feel about things, but it's going to take time. It's not going to happen immediately. How you feel about them right now is the result of what you've been putting into it for the last while, for the last couple of. Anyone know? If anyone here has been, this may not be applied to everyone, but there's something called the HbA1c, and this is for some. If you're pre-diabetic or you go at a certain age to get your blood work done, Dr. Mahmoud knows. HbA1c. What is this? This tells you what your sugars have looked like for the last couple of months. Right? It doesn't tell you if you're like, oh, my sugar today was perfect, it was 7. Give me your HbA1c. Oh, it's 12. La habibi, you're not doing very well. You're not controlling your sugars. But it was 7 today. I don't care what it is today. This tells me what it's been like for the last couple of months. And the qalb is the same. The qalb is a reflection of what's been happening for a while. So you can change it. It takes some time. We'll talk about that inshallah. The 5th piece is al-fu'ad. Al-fu'ad is the consciousness, is the actual consciousness. Your awareness, this consciousness, is what we refer to as the fu'ad. Right? This consciousness is very, very valuable. This is the most beautiful thing. إِنَّ السَّمْعَ وَالْبَصَرَ وَالْفُؤَادَ كُلُّ أُولَٰئِكَ كَانَ عَنْهُ مَسْئُولًا. The fu'ad is where the sensory system works. You're conscious, you're aware, you're able to take things in, you see things and you hear things, you're processing things. This is the direct consciousness. The subconsciousness is what is processed later. It's when you go to sleep, what's happening on the other side of things when you're not awake. What you put into the processor is going to come out. The consciousness is that awareness, your ability to, the moment you woke up and you opened your eyes and you were able to think and you were able to choose. That's the fu'ad. And then the last piece is al-aql, which is the intellect. And that's the umbrella that kind of holds it all together. The aql is the intellect that through which you're capable of so the fu'ad is taken in the sensories, what you see and what you hear and what you learn and what's happening around you. The aql is what's capable of processing that in real time. The qalb will do its own processing when you're asleep, but the aql is doing the active processing. And what you think about, which is what the aql does, goes into your heart, so you understand. If you sit there thinking about something in a negative way for a long time, you think you're going to wake up the next morning loving it. If you spend time thinking about someone in a negative way, you're not going to wake up in a couple of days feeling love for this person. If anything, you're going to build resentment for them because that's what you've been pouring into your heart. So your intellect, your ability to process information, to think about things and contemplate and reflect is one of the most powerful tools that you have. That's why I told you everything. One of the rules is you have to reflect and contemplate everything. Why? Because the aql is the one that can control the heart, but it requires a little bit of help. You have to give it time. You have to give it space so it can actually do its job. It has to think about things. It has to take all of this information. Any khilaf that exists in the world, any dispute, can end if one of the people is willing to contemplate the actual problem and think differently about the other. Let me give you an example of what I mean here. You're driving the car and someone cuts you off right in their lane. After you've finished calling him every name that you can think of in the book and thinking everything negative about this person, right? If I told you that this person here, this morning, woke up, received a phone call that his mother died. He hasn't seen her in 10 years. And he had to go to work that day, didn't give him the day off. And then his wife called him that she fell and broke her leg and she's in the hospital. And he's on his way to the hospital do you feel bad about him now? Do you still feel upset with him? Do you still want to call him names? No, you're fine. Like, no, tfaddal, please, by all means, go ahead. You can change how you feel about things, just how you look at them. The aql is what's going to allow you to do that. The aql is what allows you to reflect upon things, think, and then that's going to guide your feelings later on. But if you don't use the aql, if the intellect is not being used, if your intellectual faculties are not being used, I talked about this, if there's the potential of Adam as intellectual faculties. If you don't use them, if you don't reflect and think about things, if you don't take in all of that sensory, then you're going to end up in a position where you're not able to control anything. So those are the 6 pieces of terminology. So know what the nafs is, and its hawa, and know what the ruh is, and know what the fu'ad is, and know what the qalb is, and know what the aql is. Because these are important words. As we go through this series, I'm going to point out and talk about each of them individually. And with that, subhanallah, bihamdik, shadu la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk, wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka ala nabiyyina wa habibina Muhammad, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in.